I think of all the books I read when I was growing up, books set in Russia, in India, in Kenya. I might not have understood every single cultural reference, but I understood most of them. Turgenev certainly did not have in mind as his ideal reader a girl in southeastern Nigeria, but I read and loved the novel Fathers and Sons. I grew up bilingual, as in almost all the people I grew up with. We spoke both English and Igbo at home. Sometimes we spoke both English and Igbo in the same sentence. But we were not allowed to speak Igbo in school. It was called, with a derogatory tone, speaking in the vernacular. Even the word vernacular was wrapped in shame. I look back now at the absurdity of it, and also the great sadness of it. How colonialism's most insidious legacy is its ability to make you denigrate that which is yours. My Nigerian education was exclusively in English. Today, I cannot make a philosophical argument in Igbo because my education did not give me the tools. And it fills me with a sense of sadness to know that Igbo from Igbo will always be the language of informality. And so to use Igbo bits in my novel was to show the texture of my world, a world of two languages. I believed it was important to the integrity of my fiction, and perhaps I wanted also to make a political and emotional claim that both languages belong to me, that both languages are fully mine. My father spoke Igbo beautifully. His Igbo was not anglicized like mine, and he didn't throw in English words as my siblings and I did. He was a radiant storyteller. He told stories mostly of his childhood, so often through the years that I came to know the stories myself, and I would sometimes remind him of a detail he had omitted from a previous version. Through my father's storytelling, my grandfather, who died in Biafra during the war, came alive, as did my great-grandmother, a fierce woman who was called a troublemaker. And it is said in my family that I am a reincarnation of her. In those stories my father told, I loved the anecdotes, the proverbs, the wit, the humor. And I would soak them all up, absorb them, store them, and I began to feel a distinct sense of pride about the Igbo culture from which I came. Pride that I came from a wise and humorous and enterprising and just people. And I think there is something in my writing that speaks to this pride, while also refusing to romanticize it. Like most Igbo families, we had a second home in my father's ancestral hometown. And it was to this home, in the village, as we called it, that we journeyed at Christmas, at Easter, some weekends. Our house was an old, rambling two-story building, enclosed by cement walls, a red gate, a sandy yard. Once, my mother attempted the planting of flowers in our yard, but some stray village goats made their way into our compound. And these resourceful animals saw in the red and yellow flowers a perfectly colorful feast. And so that was that for flowers in the village. Pythons are considered sacred in my part of Igbo land. My sister told me a story of a python she found curled in my grandmother's outhouse years before I was born. My sister was terrified. But my grandmother, she said, merely walked over and spoke gently to the python, asking it to please leave so as not to scare the children. The python then uncurled itself and slid away. There were many other stories I heard in the village of people who turned into cats or dogs, birds, of people who went to secret nightly meetings at the bottom of the sea. When I discovered years later a genre of writing called magical realism, I felt a kind of resistance to the name because I knew of this world where the so-called magical was not considered remarkable, but merely part of life. The highlight for me of Christmas in the village was the masquerades. The big masquerades appeared in the village with much noise and music and commotion, and children were filled with excitement at going to see them. But girls, I was told, could not see the biggest and most exciting masquerade. Why? I asked. Well, because they're girls. The unfairness of this stayed with me, and I began early to question and to argue about the need to discard the parts of Igbo culture that diminished the humanity of women, that decreed that simply by being born female, you were automatically excluded from so much that was beneficial. You could not inherit property, you could not participate in the most prestigious ceremonies, you could not have an equal say. And my questioning, arguing process remains ongoing. Still, today, to be back in my ancestral hometown is to feel a sense of an almost atavistic belonging. It is quite simply my home. It is where I want to be buried. I like to think that this rootedness to my ancestral hometown deeply informs my writing. This metaphysical attachment to a physical place acts as a springboard for me and enables me ultimately to have the confidence to tell the stories that I want to tell. And so I want to, just a little bit of an aside on the question of my ongoing arguing, questioning about changing parts of African culture. I want to quote a great African icon, Thomas Sankara, who said, "The revolution and women's liberation go together. We do not talk of women's emancipation as an act of charity or out of a surge of human compassion. It is a basic necessity for the revolution to triumph." And in case of revolution, I would add progress, justice, even peace. And here's another small anecdote, still on the idea of questioning, arguing process. I once praised a male Nigerian comedian, and I told him that a lot of Nigerian comedy is lazily misogynistic, where the punchline is always some sort of mockery of women, and that it was refreshing to listen to his comedy. And he replied to me and said, "I hope you never see any of my earlier skits." I was very moved by that response, by the grace of it. And I told him that we are not looking for perfection, we are looking for progress. Nobody's perfect. One of the most magnificent gifts we have as humans is the ability to remake ourselves, to unlearn the malignant things we have learned, to improve, to take one small step after another on that journey of progress. I think of myself as a fiction writer who sometimes writes non-fiction. And when my fiction writing is going well, it gives me what I like to describe as extravagant joy. And when it is not going well, there is no greater source of anxiety and depression. Because of its hold on the emotional boundaries of my life, because it is central to my own sense of who I am, my writing is a deeply private act. If I did not have the good fortune today of being published and read, I will be somewhere, unknown, unread, but I would be writing. And yet, it is too simple to claim that writing is a private act, end of story. If it were so, I would write in a diary and put it away in a drawer. I write because I have to. I write because it is my vocation. I also write because I want and hope to be read. And so an audience, or the possibility of an audience, moves writing from the private to a public space. Of all the consequences of this public space that publication brings, the most significant for me is a certain loss of control. you're not in control of how you are read. And you realize the large, gaping gap between how you write and how you are read. After my first novel was published, I was often told by Americans and Europeans that my novel was a political allegory, that my abusive father character represented Nigeria's brutal dictator. Why, I wondered? Must my character somehow represent something political? Why must words like socio-political always be linked to my work? Why am I not asked about the interpersonal relationships between the characters? Why am I not asked about love? Obviously, I know the reason. The modern African novel has its roots in the anti-colonial struggle, and so little of African writing is known outside of Africa that the easy response is always to read it first as political anthropology, rather than as a story of human beings. But it does not change the truth, which is that when I sat down to write the father character in my novel, I was not thinking, I shall now write an important allegorical representation of Nigeria's military culture. Instead, the character had come to me with a hushed voice and an almost broken spirit. A teenage girl who was nothing like me and who I wanted to explore. I should clarify that my questioning this was not because I disagreed about my work being socio-political. I agreed that it was. Rather, I questioned it because it seemed to me that some writing was read in this way and others were not. And this distinction was based not on the content of the writing, but on the personal history of the writer. I did not agree with this kind of categorizing because I believe there were not literary judgments, but rather lazy cultural assumptions. Because unless we insist on a very narrow and incomplete definition of politics, what today is not political? In that sense, then, fiction is socio-political. All fiction is political. All fiction is anthropology, simply because the writing does not exist in a vacuum. All